So, welcome to Robyn Hills to the Clearing the Air podcast on our Charity Tuesdays. This is the second episode of this. And Robyn works with an organization called Food and Trees for Africa. And Robyn, I'd love for you to just give a bit of an overview of the work you do with the organization and your role in the organization.
Sure. So I'm a senior program manager. I oversee the food and trees aspect of Food and Trees for Africa, in that the food security programs encompass school gardens, community market gardens, and support of emerging farmers around SADC. And then the tree aspect is primarily urban greening, looking at reforestation and carbon sequestration. So my role is to oversee the programs, and I do 50% of the fundraising, and I'm part of the executive leadership team for Food and Trees for Africa, which is a public benefit organization in South Africa that has been running for the last 30 years and addressing climate change resilience and nation building through social development.
And you guys work a lot with school gardens and food forests and things like that. Do you mind almost giving a bit of a definition of what a food forest is and why it's so important in the context of schools and social upliftment?
Sure. So a lot of schools in South Africa have a national schools nutrition program, which is aimed at no-fee schools or schools in under-resourced areas that have government grants for subsidizing a meal for the children. But often these meals are the protein and the starch-based stuff, and it doesn't include fresh vegetables, herbs, fruits, nuts, and the sorts of things that a garden can produce. So a lot of our school-based gardens are geared towards supplementing that feeding scheme, as well as functioning as a fundraising tool and a community integration tool. So we find that schools with gardens not only have higher nutritional levels in their meal that they provide their children, but they also have good relationships with their neighbors, less truancy, and a better relationship with the community at large, because many parents and people associated with the school have the opportunity to farm on a small scale within the school grounds. And often schools have fences and water and slightly more control over the land than their neighbors would, because fences cost money and not all under-resourced houses are serviced in South Africa. So they don't always have running water, whereas most schools do. And the food forest aspect is an incredible way of stacking, what we call stacking and packing, where we have nut trees, pioneer species, shrubs and bushes that are food producing, as well as ground covers like nuts, clover, marjoram, other culinary and medicinal plants that build a ecosystem in the garden, which is more self-sustaining than traditional monocultures would be. So the outputs of these gardens are diverse, they are income producing, and they create an outdoor classroom where children are able to experience how a forest system operates. One of the main things we do with schools is curriculum integration, so that children and teachers can use this outdoor classroom to apply mathematics, language to the garden, because natural systems are such incredible teachers naturally. We also find that income production through the garden, because of selling surplus, helps to ensure that the gardens are sustainable. These gardens are not only school gardens, they're always associated with communities and have to be integrated with communities, because children by and of themselves are not particularly good farmers, because they're children and they stand on seedlings and forget where they've planted things and forget to water. So gardens often have different areas for different functions, and the forest aspect, whether it's a windbreak or a timber wood lot or fruit tree orchards, need to be integrated into those spaces. And yeah, I think they're incredible ways to find solutions in an ever-changing world where our climate systems are becoming more erratic, our rainfall is not as regular, and if we don't have these robust biomes that can weather the storms, excuse the pun, then we won't learn how to manage the future of food growing.
I think it's such a great system as well, and you touched on it, but that it's almost a disconnect from our food systems, are also forming a disconnect between communities and members of a society. And do you feel like seeing kids and adults and generally communities grow food together and come together over something like a food forest or a garden, have you seen a kind of mental improvement, especially with people living in very difficult situations? Has there been a mental upliftment within those communities?
So there's a lot of research around green spaces and people's mental well-being and how mental health can be rehabilitated through gardening and through getting hands into the soil. And I've seen that a lot at Lentegeur and a couple of other institutionalized community farms. I think at schools, I think people's mental well-being is not necessarily a sort of metric that we collect. And in my experience, I've seen it more with patients at a rehab center that I was working at before I worked at Food and Trees for Africa. But I can imagine for children, it brings a lot of peace. It brings a lot of calm because it is a focused attention on a physical activity. I know for a lot of older people, especially pensioners who work at the school gardens and that market gardens as well, they do it as a form of meditation. And that's across the board among multiple cultures and race groups and economic groups. So I would say, I mean, it's not particular to school gardens at all, but yeah, definitely. I mean, gardens are just like any natural system, builds our feeling of balance and integration and connection with nature, the planet, and ourselves.
Yeah, and we hear a lot, and it's such a sad truth that people living in poverty are always going to be the first ones to feel the effects of climate change. And it's an issue of getting people who live with huge amounts of privilege to engage with climate change because we don't necessarily see it as viscerally on a daily basis. Do you think through your work you've become more aware? Have you seen the effects more single-handedly than you might have otherwise?
Yeah, definitely. I think the first time I really noticed how drought impacts homestead gardens was when I was in Orange Farm, and the difference between one microclimate and the next. The one near the highway, there was a lot. I think we were supporting 50 homes near a highway, and of course, because there's a lot of clear cutting and bush cutting when a highway is put in, and the soil is never the same again. For like at least 50 meters on either side. And the homestead gardens in that area were just perpetually dry. I mean, they had to really search for good mulch, any mulch at all. Whereas slightly east of the same Orange Farm area, near a krans, near a koppie that had been like a small mountain or hillside that still had indigenous growth and lots of rockeries and naturally occurring habitats where there were lizards and beneficial insects. The soil there and the gardens there were amazing, and they were literally, I mean, they were 100 to 200 meters away from one another. And so the impact that humanity and climate change has had is tremendous. And poor people use their gardens as a safety net, and they grow spinach and shimolia, which is like a kind of soft leaf kale here in South Africa, a lot because those are our iron-rich vegetables, and they're versatile and they're culturally relevant. And those crops need water, and if people don't have access to water, and then if they don't have access to information about using grey water, then if a rain is late, they're going to feel it much faster and on a much larger scale. Those sorts of yeah, climate impacts. I think the middle class are aware of climate change. Um, and there's an interesting study about how people's knowledge systems doesn't translate into behavioral change. The only thing that really translates is emotional triggers. So if people are not emotionally moved, they won't reduce their single-use plastic use. They won't reduce their carbon footprint. They won't change their behaviors to make more informed decisions unless they're emotionally charged. So I think one of the biggest changes of those attitudes are through the arts, through music, through images, through stories, through drama, um, through like real action. Because and there's a I can't remember who it was, but there's a story about Jeunesse Park, who started Food and Trees for Africa, tells the story so well, where there were a group of people on a boat and a scientist was down below deck, and he kept noticing more and more stats that reinforced how real climate change was and how dangerous there was a storm that the ship was being blown into, and he was sure that the storm was going to come and they were going to intercept it, and this ship would sink. And he kept giving the stats to the team on the boat, and people understood, they acknowledged that this is the information that was accessible, they knew it. But until one of the crew members sang a song and sang it well, and sang it in an incredibly emotional way, the rest of the crew did nothing until it was almost too late. And I think that that's kind of the situation that a lot of us are sitting in, you know.
Yeah, definitely. I've seen it with myself and the people around me, and it's a question I definitely consider a lot of, how can we accept this climate crisis on an intellectual level, but not be changing all of our behaviors? I think Greta Thunberg talks about it a lot of how can everyone not be freaking out because it is
Yeah,
such a crisis. Um,
yeah.
and you, as an organization, do you mostly rely on donations to do your work or sponsorship? Because that does require people to care and have an emotional connection to the work and the cause that you are working with. As in, like, are you seeing people engage with it and care about this sort of issue that you're working for?
So luckily, it's not only an emotional issue, and luckily we don't rely on corporate gentleness for our funding. So yes, yeah, we do rely solely on donations. Food and Trees for Africa has to fundraise for everything that we do. Um, but there are incentives that South African government gives to corporates for donating to any charity or registered PBO, and those tax rebates are an incentive. So um, that's a big reason why corporates have CSR, or corporate social responsibility, or corporate social investment. And I don't know if it's the same in Germany, Amsterdam, Brazil. I don't where your counterparts live, and I'd be interested to know. But yeah, so in South Africa, corporates are incentivized through tax rebates to donate. And then in terms of how Food and Trees for Africa operates, because we plant fruit and nut trees along with our indigenous shade trees, even our greening programs are related to food security. And then all of our agroecology market gardens and school-based gardens are also food security programs. So they aren't seen only as climate mitigation activities. They kind of tick a number of boxes, which means it's easier to fundraise when you're appealing to multiple areas of people's interests or passions, and multiple areas of solution, whether in whatever society, on broad scales or on little scales. And I think that that is key for any organization or charity, is that they identify all of the potential markers for how their fundraising should happen. And biggest, I think, is that the pitch to anyone should be short and sharp and clear. Gone are the days where we send 12-page missives with academic references. We send like a 3 or 4-page pitch deck, which is, this is what we need to do, this is the problem, this is the solution, this is how much it's going to cost. Because nobody really has time to read anything anymore. And yeah, it's a hectic world, So we've got to fit in with the system,
Absolutely. I think what I do love about the work that you guys are doing is that it does show how interconnected climate change is with so many other issues that we're seeing in the world. So it is partly a sustainability climate change organization, but that links so much to food security and social issues. And I think it is so important to be talking about how climate change it's a human issue, and it's not just about saving species of animals that most people have no idea exists. It is so linked to all of the other issues we face in the world today, and we need to be looking at it as this kind of circular economy, interconnected issue. And you also spoke about, you guys use this principle of agroecology. Would you mind touching a bit more on what that means and what principles you incorporate into that?
Yeah, sure. So agroecology is as a set, it's a methodology for producing food in a way that is holistic and diverse. So bringing in multiple cash crops so that you can have a short-term income, as well as long-term ones, as well as identifying how the farm itself should be related to its immediate community and society at large. So, like permaculture, it has a series of applications that impact one another. So, for example, if we are going to support emerging farmers in a rural area, identifying their gate sales, their immediate sales, and doing their marketing is not going to be separate from what they grow and how they grow things naturally, building their soils, building their compost, including biodynamic aspects and permaculture aspects. That none of these things are seen as separate or exclusive. All of the ways of doing things can be and should be incorporated. And the way that the farmers farm as well. I mean, not everybody is familiar with a herb spiral or mandala beds. If they are, if they have existing irrigation, which is in straight lines, then intercropping and crop rotation and companion planting can still be done in those straight lines. So I think it's about sort of steering away from being too much of a purist and saying what's going to work for this farm in this community today, and applying those sorts of solutions.
Yeah, and I think that links to the idea that we need to be looking at a far more local approach for many of these issues and looking at the specific context and not sort of applying one blanket solution to diverse contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. Which reminds me of a program that EWT, Endangered Wildlife Trust, was running a couple of years ago. I'm sure they're still running it on multiple levels, where their main interest was to save the Amatola toad, a most beautiful creature and also incredibly endangered. And one of the main reasons was habitat destruction, and habitat specifically on riparian edges along riverbanks. And identifying how to protect those spaces meant identifying who was currently using those spaces. And mostly it was herdsmen and pastoral land and cattle having access to the river and destroying bits and parts of the banks. And the EWT team identified incredible ways of looking at sustainable pasturage, working with the herdsmen in this particular area and identifying how they could move their cattle in various ways and put up fences and integrate, I think, just multiple solutions for grazing techniques that were beneficial for the cattle, as well as the riverbanks, as well as the toad. And so, um, like in the Timbavati area and along the Kruger, there are so many incredible organizations and people identifying, where are these nexus points? Where are these vulnerable spots between human beings and nature? And how can they be protected in a way that everyone still gains from it? And the conservation just generally is so far ahead of sometimes, like, the general public see these things as these are solutions just for people, or these are solutions just for animals, but that's not really the case. The people on the ground are already finding highly integrated approaches of protecting our planet and our people together. It's a really beautiful, incredible thing. I think for many people, yes, education around the challenges and problems is so very, very important, but just as people become aware of the problems, they need to become aware that the solutions have, on the whole, already been found. It's just a matter of supporting the organizations and people who are doing them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this sort of December, Christmas period, people maybe have a bit more time and generosity to think about those sorts of things and to think about how they can help organizations and other people. And from your perspective, what would be the biggest help, whether it's monetary or social engagement from the general public who maybe hasn't engaged with your work? Where do you feel like you as an organization need the most assistance or attention, or yeah, what would you like from other people during this period and going forward?
It's a good question. I think on an individual level, sort of crowdfunding campaigns have not really been significant enough for the kinds of projects and budgets that we require. So, individual donations are great, and a lot of big NGOs and organizations like Greenpeace rely on them because they've got such a huge membership base. Food and Trees relies heavily on corporate donations and government grants and international aid. So I think the biggest thing that anybody can do is take personal responsibility, because when people take action themselves in their own home, in their neighborhood, they make more of a difference. The groundswell there is incredible. Like you mentioned Greta's work. Like when she said she wants people to panic, like, I want people to panic. I want people to share things on their Facebook pages. I want them to like Food and Trees for Africa's work so that people know about it. Because if there is a large scale awareness, that pushes policy, that pushes government, that pushes greater systemic change. I think people's I donate to Greenpeace my 200 Rand every month, and I know that it helps, but I think that more than that, I think when I post things regularly on social media, and when I grow my own zucchini, and I choose not to use chemical fertilizers and not to use single-use plastics, I think those choices, not only for my personal psyche, but our collective consciousness, is added to, and that groundswell then has policy change. And all of those connections in between are made by the action, not necessarily the idea.
I think that's so important to hear, because we've had discussions before through this platform, but that people can get so disheartened by the impact of their individual action and stop doing anything because they feel like their own small act doesn't have any sort of impact. But I think it's so reassuring to hear that it does matter. It is so important that even if every individual person isn't creating massive global change, together it can cause that. And I think when you're doing small actions on a daily basis, it's more about living in accordance to your values than
Yeah.
than completely changing the climate catastrophe on your own. And I think, yeah, our time is sort of coming to an end, but do you think you have any sort of final thing you want to share through this, or anything about your work or generally about sustainability?
I think this Christmas, plant a tree, hey? Plant a tree, and if you can, if you have access to vegetable seeds, plant something. Make this time with your family, with your friends, a time for planting, as opposed to buying.
I think that is a fantastic message. Thank you so much, Robyn, for engaging with us and getting involved. And we will attach all of the information about Food and Trees for Africa and where people can donate when we post this. So thank you.
Sure, Amy. Thanks for the interview.
I'll stop recording and then just say goodbye.